The Book of Revelation. How many of you are at least somewhat familiar with the Book of Revelation? Or has some name recognition? There are streams of the Christian tradition, and even people who are not connected to the Christian tradition, but that have a particular fascination with this book. And there's a popular tradition of reading it with essentially, Book of Revelation open in one hand, newspaper open in the other, trying to find places where things allegedly match up, and things of that sort. And so we're going to spend our time today actually asking the question of, can we understand the Book of Revelation? Right? I wonder how many of you would agree that the Book of Revelation, whatever else it is kind of mysterious and hard to understand. Is that a fair statement?
Yes.
Is it supposed to be? Well, let's start the way we've learned to start this semester by asking, what kind of literature is this? What kind of a book is Revelation? Is book the right answer? What are some of the kinds of literature, or what are some of the categories we could put this piece of literature into?
It's like very figurative, or there uses a lot of symbolism and stuff.
There's a lot of symbolism, and you'll sometimes hear people talk about taking the book literally, and they rarely mean what that term normally means. Right? So, for instance, if you see references to locusts with faces like lions and sting in their tail, and you interpret that as Russian attack helicopters capable of launching nuclear missiles, that's not literal. May or may not be right. We can talk about that as well, but one thing I think we should all agree is that it's not literal.
Oh, apocalyptic?
Apocalyptic. What does apocalyptic mean? What does it mean if we talk about this as an apocalypse? We use the term apocalyptic sometimes, but not always just in reference to particular types of literature in the Bible.
It's like the end of the world, or like, right?
Yeah, well, nowadays, that's the way we
Yeah.
use it, right? If you have a movie that's in the apocalyptic genre, or if you're a sci-fi fan, right, you might watch things that are like post-apocalyptic, right? So something terrible's happened. Sometimes it doesn't even matter if they ever tell you what it is. And now the Earth is a wasteland, and people are trying to survive and killing each other and all that kind of stuff that makes the movie interesting. What's an apocalypse? What is apocalyptic literature in the sense of a type of ancient literature that we can talk about? Because the Book of Revelation does fit within a category of literature. I won't go into all the details, but among the characteristics of apocalyptic literature are, as was mentioned, symbolism. Right? Usually there's either a vision or a heavenly journey, and the human seer will see strange things and is taken on, in a lot of cases, a celestial journey, has an angel as a guide or some departed patriarch who talks to him and explains to him the strange things that he sees in his vision. And so before we say anything about other kinds of literature that this could fit into, let me spend a little bit more time about apocalyptic and ask, what are other examples of apocalyptic? And one of them, which I said we'd also be talking about at least a little bit today, is the Book of Daniel, or at least the second half of the Book of Daniel. And the Book of Daniel is an interesting text for a number of reasons. Some of you may be familiar with the stories towards the beginning, because the first half of the book is narrative and stories about Daniel and his friends, the lion's den. Some of you are familiar with that story, if not any of the others. He has these three friends who end up in the fiery furnace, right? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. If you can't remember those names, if you just say quickly, my shack, your shack, and a bungalow, most people will not realize that you've not heard the Babylonian names from these characters. The second part of the book of Daniel, though, right, and there's a linguistic division. Some parts of this book are in Aramaic, others are in Hebrew. There's a lot that's puzzling and intriguing. One of the key questions that the book of Daniel raises is whether pseudepigraphy, writing in somebody else's name, is a characteristic of apocalyptic literature. Few would disagree that pseudepigraphy, writing in somebody else's name, is characteristic of apocalyptic literature outside of the Bible. Right? We have works like First Enoch, Apocalypse of Abraham, Testament of the 12 Patriarchs, which includes apocalyptic. And in pretty much all those cases, there are, I won't say there's no one, because I actually did meet an individual, but it was rather strange. But there really is practically no one who would say that these works are written by the person that they're named after. And so I thought, in order to help make the point about this, I would share with you something that I came across recently. You know how sometimes you're digging in your yard to plant a tree and you unearth an ancient apocalypse? You know the kind of thing. Here's one that I came across digging in my backyard. It says, "And lo, a man born on distant islands, but nevertheless a citizen of this country, shall win re-election. He who slew the one who felled the towers will offer change you can believe it." I'm guessing this is really ancient, and it's probably an important text because it could be a prediction of later events. What do you think? Anyone here slightly skeptical of my story about having found this in my yard?
Yeah.
Is it just because I don't look like the sort of person who goes out and plants trees, or is it for other reasons? Anyone thinking maybe I concocted this in my office and inserted it in the PowerPoint? You'd be right to be suspicious. What gives it away?
I don't think they used the term re-election back then.
Interesting. Right? So use of later terminology. Right? Of course, you might say, well, wouldn't you expect a prophetic text to use terminology from later times?
It seems, if I understand what you're referring to, like the recent re-election and everything, then it seems a little too, too exact to what actually happened. Normally, say prophecies and stuff, they're not exact of how they're said, and that often leads to misinterpretation of what's actually going to happen.
Yeah, there certainly have been those who've been cynical about the notion of prophecy. Right? Woody Allen famously did a parody of Nostradamus, offering the prediction, 2 nations will go to war, but only one shall win. You have a good chance of being right? But precisely because there's not a lot of specifics. Right? Apocalyptic literature tends to have somebody forecasting the future in detail. And for that reason, scholars have long deduced that it's worth exploring the possibility, and having explored the possibility, most are persuaded that that's in fact what we're dealing with in ancient apocalyptic works of this sort. When there's a close match to events, it's probably because someone was writing in light of those events. And so one characteristic that's often considered typical of apocalyptic literature is pseudepigraphy, writing in someone else's name. And most scholars think that the book of Daniel was written in a later time, and that later author placed a prediction about his own time on the lips of Daniel. And if we ask, why might someone do that? Well, if we look at what Daniel is made to predict, it includes a major crisis in the history of the Jewish people. And in times of crisis, people will often wonder, what would Jesus do, right? Or what would Moses say? Or what would Daniel have done if he was in this situation? Looking for someone to give an authoritative interpretation of events and to offer hope for the future, for the outcome. And apocalyptic literature does, as has already been hinted at, have a focus on the future and perhaps even on the end. But it's often related to, and the end is mentioned in connection with, or as a hope in the midst of, a difficult situation that people who understand themselves as God's chosen people are facing. In the case of the book of Daniel, right, we could work our way, if we wanted to, through chapter 11 of the book of Daniel. And it starts out with kings of Persia, and then it talks about a warrior king shall arise, connected with the kingdom of Greece, who shall rule with great dominion and take action as he pleases. Now, have any of you seen this movie? Right? So, kings of Persia, and then along comes a warrior king connected with Greece. Who is that? Do we need to have like charging noises and screaming soldiers? And make it a little bit-
I don't know his name.
Yeah. Famous warrior king of Greece. Macedonia. Alexander? Alexander the Great
Oh,
fights against the Persians,
okay,
creates
yeah.
this vast empire.
Love
So we've got Persia, and then we've got Greece. And of course, this is mentioning the kingdoms under whose rule the Jewish people live. Right? So Greece comes after Persia. Right? And then, while still rising power, his kingdom shall be broken, and those who come after him won't have comparable status. Right? Alexander's kingdom is divided among 4 of his generals. And then suddenly we have kings to the south and of the north, right? And we have the Syrian rulers to the north, Egypt to the south. Explicitly mentions places, right? Mentions Egypt, right? 11:8. Mentions the Kittim or the Romans coming and interfering. And we can actually trace these events. We know about these events. We know about the dynasties that ruled over Syria and Egypt, the back and forth between them, Roman alliances, and we even know about an individual who, and there's some debate about the translation, but the giving of a particular woman in marriage, right, in order to try to deal with these negotiations and the conflict between them. It seems to be a fairly clear reference to somebody whose name will be familiar to you, even if you don't know anything else about her. Cleopatra. And so we can trace through history, and it gets more and more precise, leading up to a time when a ruler of the north, a ruler of Syria, goes to invade Egypt. Ships of the Kittim, ships of the Romans come against him. He withdraws. He sends forces to occupy and profane the temple, abolish the regular burnt offering, set up the abomination that makes desolate. Desolating sacrilege. That thing that Jesus later alludes to, right, in Mark 13 and parallels, in the passage that we referred to. We know about this guy. Antiochus IV, Antiochus Epiphanes, as he was sometimes referred to. Desecrated the temple, rededicated the temple in Jerusalem to Baal Shomem, right, Lord of Heaven, by his Greek name Zeus Olympus. Offered a pig, right, which is unclean, on the altar. Prohibited the observance of the Jewish law. And so we can trace through and we can understand what's going on here. And the reason why lots of people read the book of Daniel and expect it to have something to do with, I don't know, Saddam Hussein, and then once he's out of the picture, it'll be somebody else, and it keeps going on, people trying to find ways that things match up, is because they don't know the ancient history that it's referring to. And referring to with such precision and with increasing precision as it goes on, that scholars think this is someone writing in the midst of this crisis, right? What's sometimes referred to as the Maccabean revolt, or the Maccabean crisis, offering guidance and reassurance to the people in the midst of this crisis when Jewish people are being persecuted. And doing so in the name of somebody who lived previously. And what's intriguing is that when we get towards the end of this book, suddenly we go from the death of Antiochus, which the author doesn't seem to depict quite as it was, at least as far as we know from other sources, and then talks about a final judgment and resurrection and things of that sort. And so one of the questions we need to ask is, if we look at the book of Daniel, if we look at other apocalypses, or other examples of apocalyptic literature's background in the book of Revelation, are they typically pseudepigraphal, right? Written in somebody else's name? Do they typically talk about distant future? Do they talk about the near future and the present of the author and relate that to the end and the final judgment? And if they do that, is that because they keep trying to predict the end and getting it wrong? Or is it an expression of hope in the midst of a crisis that God will intervene to end the persecution and do something to help? So it's important when looking at the book of Revelation to back up a little bit and ask about other apocalyptic literature. And there are still other interesting examples of apocalyptic that you can find online. So we've suggested that the book of Revelation is an apocalypse or apocalyptic literature. And in fact, the book of Revelation is the book that gives the name to that genre. apocalypsis in Greek means an unveiling, a disclosure, a revelation. And so when people talk about apocalyptic literature, very often they're starting with Revelation, saying it's literature that has some of those features that you know from the book of Revelation. And so saying that the book of Revelation is a revelation may not be all that helpful, right? But when we broaden the picture, we can see that there's a type of literature, of which Revelation is an example. What other categories could we put the book of Revelation in? And there are at least two more, and one of them I think we'll find in verse 3 of chapter 1, and one of them I think we get the biggest clue in verse 4 of chapter 1. Anyone venture a guess? Blessed is the one who reads aloud the words of the prophecy. Blessed are those who hear and keep what is written in it, for the time is near. And so another category which people sometimes place in the book is prophecy. But it's interesting to note that the book of Daniel, right, even though in Protestant Bibles and in Christian Bibles it tends to be placed among the prophets, it's in fact one of the writing. Right? It's part of that last third of the Hebrew Bible. And that's probably because even though it does offer prediction, it was written much later. Right? And that itself is a clue to when the text was written. Revelation presents itself as offering prophecy, but as we saw looking at other examples of prophecy in the Bible, prophecy in the Bible is regularly about the near future of those who are first reading it, right? And not primarily, at least, if at all, about the distant future. And we've got one more category we need to get to. Right? So after that sentence, we've got John, to the 7 churches that are in Asia. Grace to you and peace from him who is and who was and who is to come. What does that remind you of? What if we encountered an introduction like that? Letters.
Yeah.
And you'll often hear people talking about the letters to the 7 churches. Right? That's this passage that we get in chapters 2 and 3, where there's a specific message for a variety of churches in Asia Minor. In fact, I'll bring that up there. So, before you all start freaking out, thinking you knew where Philadelphia was, right? This is an older Philadelphia. Right? It was there before ours. And we learned that John is writing from Patmos to these churches, and he has a message specifically addressed to each of these churches. But in fact, there's no separate letter or introduction to each of them, right? And so the entire thing, in one sense, is presented as a letter. Right? We have this letter introduction towards the beginning of the work. It's a very unusual letter, a very strange or odd letter, but it places itself into the category of letter as well through that introduction. And so lots of clues here suggesting that what the author wrote, whoever this John was, and John's not an uncommon name, there have been attempts to identify him with other Johns that we know of in the Bible, but his references to apostles, seemingly as a category other than himself, other things he writes suggest that may not be that John, John the son of Zebedee. Unlike the book of Daniel, the author seems to be someone who's actually known to these churches, and so it may be that Revelation, unlike other apocalypses, is not superfavorable. We'll see. But it presents itself as something which ought to be relevant to its recipients. And that's an important clue, because if Revelation is what a lot of people seem to think it is, then this John, whoever he was playing a really sick joke on these churches. Right? In fact, one of the passages we're going to focus on a little later is one where it says, whoever has wisdom, let him calculate the number, right? Because it's a man's number. And you can imagine them writing to John saying, we think we've got it figured out. Could it be this guy? And then he says, ha, you guys are so stupid. I was talking about this guy, Barack Obama. He's going to live in the distant future. Something like that. Whatever, depends on which political party you work for, who you think is the sort of conspiracy theory guy.
My bad.
No. That was interesting. He tells them to understand it, right? And gives all these references to the time is near, and yet supposedly is sending them something that they have no way of understanding. Maybe that's not the right way to approach it. And so we ask, what is Revelation about? if we ask, is it about the future? Well, it certainly talks about the future. But whose future? Right? Ours or John's? And there are things which seem to refer to the present. And one of the passages which I think is perhaps the most decisive for shifting one away from the sort of left behind end times kind of approach to the book is found in Revelation 17, where the author refers to a series of kings, right? And also 7 hills, right? Famous city with 7 hills, Rome, right? 7 kings, of whom 5 have fallen, 1 is living, and the other is not yet come. If that's not true when he writes it, then when is that true? I mean, does it suddenly kick into effect when Hal Lindsey, who was before your time, and I think most would agree was wrong about stuff, but, you know, successors like Tim LaHaye, and next generation will have another one. Somebody comes along and cracks the code, and then suddenly the present tenses kick into effect? I guess you could try and argue that, but isn't it more natural to understand the text when it refers to the Roman Empire, or alludes to the Roman Empire, when it refers to kings who rule in the present, to suggest that the author was actually talking about things going on? Let me bring up very quickly, this is from Leon Morris, who helpfully brought together 4 different approaches and gave them titles. One that's often called the preterist approach. I have a feeling that that was a label stuck on it by somebody who didn't want anyone to think this was the right approach, because it's a weird name that no one's going to remember. But suggests that the book arises out of and refers directly to the situation of the church in the first century alone. Doesn't mean that it's necessarily irrelevant to people in other times. But like, let's say, the letters of Paul, right? The appropriate approach is to understand it in its original context first, and then go on to ask what, if anything, it might mean for you if you're interested in it. The historicist approach, which treats the book as a prediction, but of the whole of human history. Right? And so you've got the Crusades in there, and you've got Charlemagne, and you've got the Protestant Reformation, and it's all. The futurist approach sees the whole book, except perhaps for the first few chapters, as referring to the end time and the second coming of Jesus. So the passages addressed directly to those churches in Asia Minor are either treated as genuinely for those churches in John's time, or as having to do with ages of the church down the centuries, and then the rest is treated as having to do with the end of time, second coming, stuff like that. And then there's the idealist approach, which says it's not about any particular king or any particular kingdom or any particular time. It's about any time when the people of God find themselves persecuted, whenever there's a ruler who demands worship for himself. You could call that the if the shoe fits approach. So if you're demanding worship for yourself, you're the beast, right? It doesn't matter whether you're particularly who John had in mind. Right? The symbols are aimed at anyone, right? And aimed at being reusable and reapplicable. We won't discuss which view is closest to your own if you have one, but I suspect that at least one of these may be familiar to at least some of you. And one of the most important things that you can take away from this class, hopefully, if you're familiar with one of these but not the others, is that there's more than one way of understanding this book. And there has been throughout the history of interpretation of it. Well, certain texts have a particular fascination for a lot of people. And oftentimes those texts are also crucial in making sense of the work. Right? I made reference to the fact that John, the author, seems to expect readers to understand what he's saying. Right? It says in chapter 13, right? This calls for wisdom. Chapter 13, verse 18. This calls for wisdom. Let anyone with understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a person. Its number is 666. Have you all encountered the number 666 before? If a realtor was showing you property and drove up in front of a house that's house number 666, would you say, that's okay, I don't need to see this one, keep moving? There's a lot of superstition, there's a lot of speculation about this number. It also appears occasionally on heavy metal album covers. The book says to calculate the meaning of the number. And so let's actually do that. And I thought it would be worth doing that. So one of the first questions I ask is, how do you calculate the number of a word? It does depend on the language, or it might depend on the language. Let's look at some of the ways that people have gone about this, and hopefully we'll narrow down then and focus on some that are worth taking seriously in the context of a course like this. But the ones I'm going to show you, I expect some of them may get a chuckle, and some of them may dismay you, and some of them may puzzle you. But they're all ones which I think the people who suggested them actually meant them to be taken seriously. Whether we can or should is another question. Particularly during the Protestant Reformation, it was popular to regard the Pope as the Antichrist. Now, of course, the Antichrist is a term that's not actually used in the Book of Revelation, but blending together beast, Antichrist, these terminologies. So how did they go about making the case for that? Well, they took this Latin phrase, Vicarius Filii Dei, Vicar of the Son of God, took all the letters that have corresponding Roman numeral values, added them up, get 666. Now, if you're Roman Catholic, you might be thinking, I've heard the Pope referred to as the Vicar of Christ, but never Vicar of the Son of God. How does Vicar of the Son of God do? Well, the answer is simple. If he's Vicar of Christ, guess what? It doesn't add up to 666. And what you'll find with most of these is that you have to tweak the name, tweak the title, tweak the evidence in order to get it to fit. With computer technology, that's less necessary. I found a program online once where you could plug in anyone's name or any word or anything you like, and it would find some system whereby you could identify that person as the Antichrist, as their name is adding up to 666. This one just about sounds plausible, right? Mac users, you know what we talked about here. Okay. Now, sometimes computers cause you grief, but seriously, well, there's a web page out there, right? Points out full name, William Henry Gates III. Convert his letters, or the letters of his name, to ASCII values, right? The computer values, and you get the following: right? Bill Gates 3, add it all up, 666. The 3, right, is the clue. Otherwise you get 663, right? So you've got to work that in there. I'm guessing you're not quite persuaded yet. So let me show you more evidence that was on this website. Some of his well-known operating systems fall into the same category. MS-DOS 6.21. You got to be very specific. Windows 95. There you go. Could Windows compatibility be the more acknowledged function by yourself? As a PC user, it seems to be much more plausible that Windows compatibility would be the mark with which one finds it impossible to get done the things one wants to get done. During the Cold War, there was a fervor in apocalyptic expectations and interpretation of Revelation in relation to events. Revelation features things falling out of the sky on people, and so you can, perhaps if you know anything about the Cold War era, you'll understand that people were very worried about things falling from the sky that might devastate the world. President Reagan was identified as the Antichrist by some, simply because his name is Ronald Wilson Reagan, 6 letters each name. And the Soviet President Gorbachev was identified as the Antichrist because he has an unfortunate birthmark on his head, which doesn't look anything like the number 666, but when there's this cultural climate of making these identifications, it doesn't take much. Okay? Here's one more. Use Latin, right? Use Roman numeral. Now, you all know that song's just a little bit creepy, right? I love you. And of course, it is this dragon-like entity, right? So, I'm sharing this not so that you will suddenly find you no longer appreciate Barney, if you ever did before, but just to show that if you want to, you can identify just about anything, right? If you, I think it's time to end the song. Okay. Sorry for those of you who are disappointed. What happens if we look for, and I shared these and it's somewhat frivolous, but there are people who take identifications with things in their own time very, very seriously, right? what happens if we take seriously what the text says, including the fact that it says you can calculate the number if you're reading it in John's time when you receive this thing that he sent to them. Right? Then maybe we'll ask about figures from the first century. We'll ask about number systems in Greek and in Hebrew, right, or Aramaic, right, languages that would have been spoken by John, his readers. Right? And some interesting things happen when we start doing that. Right? The Greek alphabet, the Hebrew and Aramaic alphabet, all use every letter as representing some number, which means that every single word also has a numerical value. Anyone want to guess what the numerical value of beast is in Greek? Take a stab. 666. There we go. So when he says it's the number of beast, it's the number of beast, quite literally. Some interesting things happen though when we realize that early Christians also, a lot of them also spoke Aramaic or Hebrew or both, or at least knew both, and could use that in making sense of it as well. Right? So there's a rendering in English of the way you'd say Nero Caesar, Caesar Nero in Greek, Nero and Kaiser. Right? Hebrew and Aramaic only have consonants, no vowels, right? So you just take out the vowels and just have consonants. You add it up, and you get 666. The author seems to have expected people to understand and to calculate and to figure it out. And of the suggestions, this is the one that seems the most likely. And here's one of the reasons why. You've probably never heard about the other number of the beast. But if you read footnotes in your Bible, you might. We call him Nero. What happens if you pronounce it the Latin way, like Nero, rather than adding that N sound on the end the way the Greeks would? We take off that final end as 50, you get 616 rather than 666. Guess what? Some manuscripts of the book of Revelation have the number 616 there. And that number could also have been applied to the Emperor Caligula, who interestingly enough tried to get a statue of himself set up in the temple in Jerusalem, but died before he could make that happen. But the fact that we have variant manuscripts that have different numbers, both of which add up to Caesar Nero, depending how you're spelling it, leads a lot of people to think, maybe that's what he was talking about. And maybe ancient interpreters actually understood that was what he's talking about. And when they were spelling the name differently because their mother tongue was a different language or their primary language was a different language, they actually fixed the number in the text. So why might Nero be thought of as an antichrist or beast? If you don't know the story, you can watch the classic movie, Quo Vadis. I'm guessing it's quite possible that none of you have ever seen it. But it's about Christians in Rome in Nero's time. And it's based, it's got a lot of legend in it, but if you want to know what the legends were about Nero and the early Christians, and Peter and Paul, things like that, it's a movie worth watching. Sir Peter Ustinov, the late Sir Peter Ustinov, does a wonderful job portraying Nero as somewhat unhinged. There's a fire in Rome during Nero's time. What do people do when there's a major catastrophe? Who do they blame? Whoever's in charge, right? And I think somebody said God, and of course that happens too. But if you're the president or the king or the emperor or whatever, you're not going to get off the hook, right? And very quickly, rumors started that Nero, right, he had plans for rebuilding and renovating Rome. Maybe he started the fire so he could then rebuild the way he wanted it to be. What do you do if you're the politician or the ruler and people are starting to blame you? You look for a scapegoat. And Nero chose the Christians. And so we have, for the first time in history, emperor-sponsored persecution of Christians. And so there's reason why the author might have thought of Nero in these terms. And there's further evidence. Nero commits suicide. He's not given the usual public funeral ceremony. What do you think happens? Conspiracy theories break out. Right? Why didn't they have a public funeral? Maybe he's not really dead. Maybe he's going to come back. Maybe we should be worried. Are you worried? I'm worried. People start freaking out. And to make matters worse, Nero imposters start appearing in this period. One of them goes to the neighboring kingdom that has these long-standing tensions with Rome and almost persuades the king of Parthia to lend him an army so he can go back and take back his throne. Right? So some people are freaking out. Right? And we get this reference in chapter 13 to the beast having a deadly wound that was healed. Right? So a figure returning from the dead. And that's intriguing, right? On the one hand, on the symbolic level, it's like this demonic parody of the resurrection, right? And the lamb who was slain earlier on. Here you have the deadly wound that was healed. Right? On the more literal level, or on the referential level, what was it referring to? Is there any way we can know for certain what the author had in mind? Perhaps not, right? And particularly as sevens are often symbolic, the reference to 7 heads and 7 kings, 5 of whom have fallen, 1 now is, 1 is yet to come. Maybe it is used symbolically there too. Right? Most are gone, and there's not much left, or something like that. But if you start counting with Julius Caesar, right, you skip out people who don't hold the throne for any real length of time, guess who ends up being the 6th one? Right? The one who now is? Nero. And then who's the one who's still to come? And there's a 7th and an 8th. And so maybe the author was actually living during the time one of those short-lived claimants to the throne after Nero's death. It can be very hard to figure out. But one other last piece of information I'll mention, which is particularly striking. In chapter 17, which I had you read, right, you have not just the beast with the multiple heads representing the kings, but you also have this woman, who's said to be a prostitute, who we're told represents, verse 18, the woman he saw as the great city that rules over the kings of the earth, and so seems to represent Rome. And there's reference to the beast, who represents the kings, actually attacking the woman, and says, they'll devour her flesh and burn her up with fire, verse 16. Right? And so there too we might have an allusion to Nero being blamed for what happened in Rome in fire. It's not unambiguous because there's lots of symbolism here. There's no way it could be completely unambiguous. Perhaps one reason for the ambiguity and the coding is precisely because the author and the people living through this time found themselves risking persecution. Right? And so they're criticizing those who are ruling, they're criticizing the Roman Empire, but they are doing so sort of discreetly. If we're to look for a meaning that could have been understood by ancient readers, I think this is at least the sort of line of approach. Okay, let's make one last attempt at a contemporary identification. Just a name picked at random. M in Roman numerals is 1,000. I'm off the hook. Okay. Try it in Hebrew. Again, 2013. I'm off the hook. Although maybe that's next year and has some. I don't know. I started figuring it out in Greek and ended up over the amount as well. Although overshot 666. So hopefully you'll remember the importance of interpreting this text in its original context and looking for a meaning that could have been understood by the ancient authors. But if you remember nothing else, and you're still not sure who the beast was or the Antichrist was, at least remember who it's not. But to not end on a completely frivolous note, let me send you just with a few quick thoughts that there's a lot more to the book of Revelation than talk about the end time, talk about beasts, talk about judgment. There's a lot of worship in there. There's a lot of singing in there. Right? Some of the singing is actually familiar. In fact, you'll probably have tunes pop into your head if you come across some of them. There's this depiction of heavenly worship, right, as an ideal. And there's reference to the worship of the beast. So emperor worship, right, things that were increasingly Christians were being demanded, or having it demanded of them that they do, and which they refused to do, and which could lead to their persecution. Right? So readers were called on to choose between the heavenly worship of God and the Lamb and the earthly worship of the Roman Emperor and the gods of Rome. When we focus on the text simply as a mystery that's supposed to be unlocked by us, because it's about us, there's a lot that we'll miss. And I wonder if the popularity of the sort of end times approach to the book of Revelation is precisely because it's hard for particularly American Christians to imagine that it's not about us. It's not about our time. It's not focused. Isn't America in there somewhere? These kinds of things. If we actually pay close attention to the text, we go back and what meaning could this have had for the earliest readers? We find not only that there are answers to those questions, but that there are very good and very plausible answers which actually help us understand a lot of the details in the text.